In the early 1950s, there was a war brewing between the Maumau fighters and the British regime. The fight was about interest of our land, Kenya.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded maumau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya.
In the midst of the war, the British went ahead and set up an estimate of 100 detention camps on the vast land of Kenya to rehabilitate the maumau.
The struggle against maumau has been long. It will, I'm afraid, continue for some time longer.
We've got to remember, we haven't been building prisons in Kenya. Lots of our prisons are still the same ones the British built.
The stories and atrocities that came out of these detention camps.
I was beaten. My father was beaten.
Men being castrated.
Everybody in the camp
being beaten up.
Were gruesome.
I think those camps
Repair the damages done by maumau
was just...
The British government recognises
and to press ahead as hard as we possibly
a torture station.
That Kenyans were subject to torture
with peaceful development for the future
and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. The British government sincerely regrets that these abuses took place.
By the end of 1880s, there was a war brewing between the Marxists and the imperialism. The war was about gaining and annexing land in East Africa for their own selfish, beneficial reason. The British penetration in East Africa began at Zanzibar in the last quarter of the 19th century. And by the end of 1888, they had already started invading Kenya and claimed its territory and established the Imperial British East African Company, which now today is our country, Kenya. When they came to East Africa and more so Kenya, for some time, they were thought to have positive impact because the reason for invading East Africa was to abolish slave trade, which was popular in late Victorian country, prevent Germans from invading their African territories, but most important, it was raw material that they were after, which include ivory, rubber, palm oil, cocoa, diamond, tea, and tin, and also to control stopover ports so that they can control off areas of the southern and east African coast of Africa and use them as stopover ports on the route to Asia and India. There's a saying that says, if something is for free, then you are the product. When the British set their foot in Kenya, they saw a land filled with opportunities, and nobody was prepared for the violence and atrocities that were going to be unleashed. In our land, they saw that it could be cultivated and produce tea, sisal, and other farming activities. 1895, Kenya became a British protectorate, and by 1894, they had already came up and formed the Land Acquisition Act. The British then went ahead and made Kenyan Land Crown Ordinance by 1902, which made it legitimate, owned by the Queen of England. This made it possible for them to manipulate and steal land from Kenyans. At the time, Kenya and its communities had its leaders whom they were approached, and some resisted while others collaborated and sold their parcel of lands in controversial land agreement like the known Anglo-Maasai Agreement that was signed in August 1904, which saw the Maasai community lose large amount of their grazing land to white settlers. The British then moved the Maasai off Nakuru, Naivasha North to Laikipia in a perpetuity to extend white farms and ranching north. For those who could not collaborate and resisted, violence was the only option. During this colonial era, the British evicted an estimate of more than 500,000 people. The land was later transformed into agricultural farms, which till today are multi-billion corporations, like Unilever, Williamson Tea, Finlay's Lipton, which make $1 million of profits every year. As a result, Kenyans became a source of labor for the British farm that hosted tea and sisal plantation. But this wasn't enough for the British. It is alleged that the British land grab was in a large scale, that they introduced the British East African Disabled Officer Colony, which was a scheme for injured white war veterans to acquire 25,000 acres of farmland in Kenya. Kenyans were later pushed to less fertile land and were retained as cheap labor. For more than 50 years, Kenyans were being oppressed and taken advantage by the British, and within villages and communities, an uprising revolting against the British rule was evolving. The British saw this as a threat, and a state of emergency against the maumau and other revolts was launched in October 1952.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded maumau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya.
It led to a series of murders between Kenyans and the British as they challenged the colonial authority by raiding white settlers' farms and destroying livestock, also attacking political opponents. Various tactics were launched by the colonial regime against the maumau, which was divide and rule. They found loyalists among Kikuyus who were bought as home guards to fight the maumau, which turned into a civil war among Kikuyus. Second, they built detention camp as rehabilitation center for the maumau to renew and denounce their odds against the British regime.
We've got to try now, at a very early date, to repair the damages done by maumau and to press ahead as hard as we possibly can with peaceful development for the future. The struggle against maumau has been long. It will, I'm afraid, continue for some time longer.
The main aim of your rehabilitation work? The main aim is to try and bring these rather fanatical people back to normal life, to clear the maumau out of their system.
As a result, the British suppressed the maumau revolution, killing about 13,000 Africa and relocating more than 100,000 people under detention camps that had harsh conditions. By 1956, the British military had effectively crushed the Mau Mau uprising and also captured Dedan Kimathi, who was their leader of Mau Mau.
His capture will have a great psychological effect, for the Mau Mau leaders still at large are only small fry. Without Kimathi, Mau Mau's days are numbered.
Although the Kenyan administration still had to deal with thousands of the Mau Mau rebellion held in camps, Sir Evelyn Baring, who was the Kenyan governor at the time, Baring administration came up with different techniques to deal with the inmates in the camp. According to the Hanslop document, officials were telling ministers if they are going to sin, they must sin quietly. Many suspects who were taken into pipeline camps were treated increasingly harshly until they denounced their belief. Others were put in trial in special court, and more than 1,000 were sent to the gallows. This is where we encounter the dilution technique, which was one of a form of torture improvised by the British administration, which involved a system of assaults and physiological shocks to detainees to force the toughest victim to break down. Terence Gavagan was the mastermind behind this torture technique, and he needed permission to treat the worst detainee in a rough way, which approval came from the cabinet minister within weeks. Inside the camps, papers shows that the detainees were beaten and forced to the ground. Once there, a boot was placed on their throat while mud was forced into their mouth, which was carried by European officers themselves.
Did you have cause to give the order to, or yourself put your boot on their neck of these resistors, the ones that were howling?
Can we stop talking for a moment?
No, because I'd quite like you to answer that.
I will answer it when I have stopped talking for a moment.
If they dare deny not taking the oath, they were given a summary of punishment, which consists a good beating, which breaks a large portion. If this doesn't bear fruit, they were taken far end of the camp where buckets and stones were waiting. Buckets will be placed at the detainee head, and he was made to run around in circle until he agrees to confess to the oath taking. If you pass this, you will be subjected to a third-degree torture, where you are kept awake all night, and water was being thrown at you, and you received some beating. The second torture technique was the Koan plan, which the regime used forced labor on inmates on the farms under threats of beating. This unlawful use of violence of the Koan's plan blew things out of proportion on the Hola incident. Hola camp, which was established as hardcore detainees camp with a population of about 506 inmates, It's alleged that the camp commander in Hola detention wanted to put Cohen's plan into motion and ordered 88 of the detainees to forced labor. As a result, 11 of the detainees were clubbed to death after violence erupted between reluctant detainees and camp guards. The rest of the detainees sustained serious injuries. The British really tried to cover up this incident by saying that the detainees who had lost their lives had drank contaminated water in the camps.
What does it mean, enforcement, though?
Well, enforcement, manhandled, so that a man who is standing up is down, that his head is on one side while he's being shaved, that his trousers are pulled off, that he's put into trousers. And so...
Were they ever knocked unconscious?
No, never.
Although the truth is like light, it blinds falsehood. In 1959 June, an article by Time magazine entitled The Hola Scandal described the real event that took place. The news shook the world and it stained the British name in a negative way. It put pressure on the British Parliament and all colonial detention were closed throughout Kenya and prisoners were freed soon after.
I think those camps was just a torture station.
Right after independence, most of these detention camps were turned into prison and secondary school, which endure to this day. Memories of them have been almost entirely and deliberately wiped out in both Kenya and in UK. It's alleged that it was illegal and you could be jailed just saying the word maumau until 2003, when the ban was lifted. What was left of the victims who endured torture from this detention camp was psychological trauma and lifetime injuries.
I was beaten, my father was beaten, everybody in the camp.
For more than 5 decades, all of these atrocities came to light when the British government admitted that it had held irregular archived documents of former 37 colonies that came to be known as the Hanslop Files.
They've been waiting almost half a century, but Kenya's Mau liberation fighters finally have an apology from the country's colonial-era rulers.
We understand the pain and grievance felt by those who were involved in the events of the emergency in Kenya. The British government recognizes that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration.
So more than 5,000 elderly Kenyans are to share a payout from the British government worth almost £20 million.
Haiwezi kutosha. Enough? It can't be enough. We were detained for 10 years. I was detained for 7 years with my father, who raised me.